Cannabis Business Minds, we train and mentor professionals, entrepreneurs, and aspiring entrepreneurs on how to confidently find their place in the legal cannabis and hemp industries. Come on and join us at cannabisbusinessminds.com. Hello, Cannabis Business Minds, and I hope you're doing well. On this episode, we get to dive deep into a lot about New York and a lot about an emerging market. Now, this whole episode isn't about that. Our guest has, decades of corporate experience working in transactions. So he is a lawyer, he's an author, and a huge cannabis advocate. And on this episode today, Charlie works at Vicente Sederberg and heads up the corporate transactions department. So very, very knowledgeable about mergers and acquisitions and a lot of that type of work. We kind of go down some rabbit holes about what's happening in New York, his opinion on it, my opinion on it. We also talk about what he's been seeing in M&A, mergers and acquisitions throughout the country. And it's a really good conversation that we talk about business advice, but nothing that's going to stand out because the whole podcast episode is jam-packed with it. So if you are thinking about working in the New York market, if you are supporting the New York market, this is definitely a podcast episode to listen to if you're supply chain or if you're an ancillary provider. But also a lot of the stuff that we're talking about could be, if you are still not in a state that is legal or regulated, could be something that could happen in your state. So really good episode here. Now, there are a few things that I want you to think about when you're listening to this episode, because the more I think about it, FYI, I've recorded 3 podcasts about New York. Why am I so interested? I'm so interested, not because I'm a New Yorker, because I see that the state is doing it wrong. And it is, y'all, our responsibility as participating in this industry to be a voice of change, to be a voice of reason, and to take charge. And if it even feels uncomfortable, to stand up when everybody is saying something and you don't agree with it. Now, what do you think I mean by that? Well, for me, and I don't know how much we talk about it in this episode, but dude, the tax structure is totally messed up. It's not set up for success. It's California 2018 all over again. And regulators don't seem to care about it. Startups aren't talking about it. And the meetings that are happening on the ground, with the associations, they are not doing justice about this. So it was a very inspiring conversation because I felt like, after this episode that I'm working on actually trying to make an impact with this. So if you're interested, you know where to find me. But what I want, even if you're not interested, what I do want you to take away from this is that your voice freaking matters. Just like you building community to build your business, you also want to take charge and get involved locally. Even, y'all, because you know where I live right now, I'm in Portugal, even if your local government is not 50 miles away, or 50 miles away or farther. In my case, it's many miles away. But I really do want you to take that away. So big jam-packed episode. Get ready, get excited. If you have any questions, if you have any comments about this episode, you know where to find me. If you want to reach out to Charlie, he has listed all his emails. We also have him in the show notes. Make sure that you find him. And he does have a book all about legal and regulatory and taxes in the cannabis industry. And all of the book proceeds go to the Last Prisoner Project. So if you're interested, we've also put a link in the show notes. Without any further ado, I hope you enjoy this show.
There's been so much movement in New York. I know that you're very much focused in this and also a lot of other things, but what is happening right now in New York as of, today in November? How's the scene looking?
So first off, great question, because it's very confusing, because I think the biggest kind of gap between, I guess what I'll say, professionals that interact with regulated industries and I guess, kind of casual observers. And then obviously like, you are much more on the professional side, but us is the sort of the way the mainstream media presents, the law has passed, right? And you think, okay, the law has passed. Now cannabis is legal, right? And in some senses, that's true. I mean, there were aspects of the MRTA, which is the bill that legalized adult use cannabis in New York, that are effective immediately. So the criminal stuff kicked into effect immediately, which is one of the reasons right now, if you walk around Manhattan, there's, you smell weed everywhere. So that went into effect immediately, but the actual issuance of the licenses to allow people to operate, state legal businesses, that, there wasn't really a timeline in the statute for that, or in the bill for that. And that's common. So some states, sometimes they'll give themselves, sometimes the legislature will write in a deadline, you have to issue the licenses by this date. But, I guess in my experience in cannabis is that the only thing you can really assume is that they're not going to hit their expected timeline.
Yeah.
Because, we've just seen it happen. You saw it happen in Canada. You've seen it happen in all these different states. It's just that, their timelines are just they just never hit their time. So anyway, I always tell people this, in terms of what's been issued to date in New York, right? So you've got 10 medical licensees. The registered organizations are ROs. Those are the medical licenses. And then they've issued conditional grow licenses. So, they just had a harvest in New York. So they have conditional grow licenses, conditional processing licenses, and they've finished the licensing. Well, I shouldn't say they finished the licensing round. They finished accepting applications for these, what they call the card licenses, which are the conditional adult use retailer. Actually, I'm not exactly sure what the acronym stands for, but it's the conditional retailer license. And those are the ones that were restricted to people that had, essentially it was restricted to people that had cannabis convictions in the state of New York.
Okay. So kind of social equity. How is it, do you have insight of are there caps to licenses? Like, what do you believe that when licenses are able to be granted, how is it going to look? It's such a big, I was working in Los Angeles, so I believe that Los Angeles is the biggest cannabis market, but a lot of people say, well, no, it's New York. And so is the regulatory framework set up in a way where startup entrepreneurs can maybe have a chance at some of this?
So, I think the intent of the New York bill, at least, was to create room for the little person. Okay. There are really strict restrictions on vertical integration. So you can really only be on, it's similar to the alcohol model. It's a modified 3-tier distribution model. So essentially you have to be on the production side or on the, sort of retail side. You can't be on both. With sort of a minor nuance is that you can get a distribution and there's also a distributor, right, that sits in the middle between the two. Now you can get a distributor license, but you can only distribute your own product. Yeah. So the bill itself didn't have any restrictions on the number of licenses that could be issued in the state, but it kicked it all to the Cannabis Control Board, which they like to refer to themselves as the office. So I'm going to call them the office for this call, but if you watch their meetings, that's what they call themselves, the office. So it kicked all these license caps to the office, and it said they want to give 50% of the licenses to social and economic applicants. Now the office has come up with a lot of things that weren't really in the MRTA. So this conditional adult use retailer license, which is only for people with cannabis convictions. I think you could say the spirit of the license was in the statute, but there really wasn't anything in the statute for any of these sort of conditional licenses.
Which is very interesting because what does that mean? Because laws passed. Now we have this body that is now responsible for inputting regulations. What does that mean? If that seems like it's already a gray area right now, is that kind of predicting there could be lawsuits down the road, or what does that mean from a legal perspective?
I think there could be lawsuits.
Yeah.
The statute gave them a lot of authority. But I think someone could argue that they may have exceeded their authority in promulgating some of these regulations. I'm not saying that myself, but there's certainly a lot of details in the regs that were not in the statute. So yeah, taking a step back to what I said earlier, like this is like one of the big things to me that I learned, when I switched from, I guess, I'll call it the normal law world to cannabis world, when I started to deal more with new statutes, is that people don't always realize that there's a huge gulf, in some cases, not always, between what a bill says, what a statute, you pass a bill, then it's codified into statute, right? And then there are regulations that are promulgated pursuant to that statute. And it can take a while, it could take up to 2 years, to get these regulations. By the way, we're still waiting for the adult use regulations in New York. And there's a lot of, So there's stuff that's been trickling out, right? There's like licensing regulations. You've got packaging and labeling regulations, but you don't have the full suite of adult use regulations. So anyway, the bottom line is there's a lot of nuance and a lot of important information that can be in these regulations. And that's where the rubber meets the road, for the industry. So in effect, you've got, and they also just dropped some late, and this has been going on. What's making New York so interesting is the information is coming out on a rolling basis. So they just dropped stuff with respect to the retailers, at the end of October, that we, are digesting. Candidly, I haven't had a chance to read the full thing yet, but my colleagues have read it, and we've got a summary of it now. There's a few pieces in there we can talk about that I think are pretty interesting, just unique to New York State. But they've also been putting out all these FAQs. And the FAQs are it's not necessarily regulation, but it's, important for the operators, because they'll tell you how they're intending to interpret things. So, and these things are dropping, right? So I tell people, I was like, well, as of today, this is what we understand, but it's changing on a week by week basis.
And is it also changing because if people are going to the office? I'm just comparing this to when I worked on the West Coast, and, regulations would drop. Then you would have an opportunity to voice your opinion, all of that. Is that kind of the still period where they're kind of these, because if there haven't even been full regulations, they're kind of draft. People would have the opportunity to input and say, hey, this is totally not cool, so that's kind of where we are in that. Timeline.
So New York is a lot like, so a lot of states are like this. New York is like California. There's, under state law, they have to publish something in the state register, and then there's a period of time where you can comment, and then they may or may not take the comments, and sometimes there can be a second comment period, sometimes not.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Well, I feel like for me, what was just fascinating about New York is that you see, and exactly what you said about kind of the media portrayal of like, oh, there's 38 states now that have, programs. But then when you think about it, you're like, well, actually people can't legally go buy cannabis still. There's still no infrastructure there. But what was shocking to me, because there seems like, and I'm not in New York, there's so much buzz and so many people that are meeting and all of that. But some of the main issues that I saw in California, like the tax, is something that seems so crippling in New York because it's based off of milligrams of THC, which is really, from a distributor perspective, which is really interesting and also very harmful for a lot of these businesses. But it doesn't seem like those conversations are happening, but are they? And I guess if people wanted to get involved in those, because it's just, I think what's interesting about now seeing so many states move into, being more mature or just starting out, you can kind of see what went wrong. And that those regulators or the people maybe in quote unquote the office have looked and talked to those people. But why? I guess I'm like, what is the question that I'm asking you? But like, if there are concerns about bigger things that could impact lots of businesses, what are, people supposed to do?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of lobbying going on behind the scenes. There are organizations in New York that are lobbying the office. I mean, this is a pretty politicized industry at this point.
Yes.
And it's especially become more and more politicized, as part of the change in politics around race and gender in the country. So that remains, that's a politically hot topic. So there's a lot of that going on. I mean, in my opinion, I think the system is too restrictive, in a lot of ways from a corporate perspective. For example, like in my world, right, one of the big challenges is the materiality of disclosure for your investors. So, let's say you own a store in New York, right? And you have to raise money for your store. Do you have to get all of your investors fingerprinted or not? So it depends on the state. A lot of states have a materiality threshold. Like here in Massachusetts, it's 10%. So if you bring in someone and they're 9.9% investor, they don't really have to go through the process. But New York right now, at least on the adult use side for retailers, it's still pretty much looking at like no materiality threshold, which can create issues for people trying to raise money. So my concern, and I know they've raised the materiality threshold on the licensing side for the testing licenses, because we're working on a testing license raise. But, my concern is that if you make the system, because I think I understand what they're coming from, is their concern is that the people that are on the night license are not actually people running the company, right? That there's some investor group pulling the strings, getting the benefit from it. And that's one concern, but I don't think they've addressed the other risk here, which is that if you tell people that don't have a lot of money, which is, I assume, the group of people that they're trying to benefit through the social equity program, hey, if you want to raise money, you've got to jump through all these hoops. And we both know that raising money in cannabis right now is brutally difficult to begin with. I mean, you're setting people up for failure. And that, I think, and you do that on one side, and then you add in the high taxes, the red tape. And then on the flip side, you allow an illicit, unregulated market to operate with impunity. You're asking for California 2.0.
You are. Thank you. Because every time I did this whole outreach to tons of people in New York after I looked at the tax, it's like, is this a concern to you? And be like, oh, we'll figure it out. I was like, but with 280E, with an illicit market, I completely agree with you. Yeah. And I think that is the hard part of you really do have to push. You really do have to lobby. You do have to pick your battles, and you have to be very passionate about it. And I'm curious, because there's so much I want to talk to you about this. Your job isn't at this moment in law to go help operators apply for licenses. It's much more related to acquisitions or working with investors, or could you expand a little bit about what you, as the lens of what you're doing right now, when you think about working in a new market or an existing market, where are you really focused? Because there's so much to focus on in law.
So in terms of my role on my team is I tend to work on people structuring right now in a new market like New York, right? I mean, you've only got 10 licenses and there's a limited amount of M&A going on. So most of it is about, forming and structuring companies and then raising money. So it's helping people figure out, how can we structure our company and raise money. And then other people on my team work on the applications themselves, submitting, we submitted a bunch of applications for these card licenses. So that's what I spend a lot of time I think about is looking at the rules and regulations and thinking about how are you going to raise money? Because, the other thing to keep in mind is with these card licenses, right? The people that meet these qualifying standards have to own 51% of the company, right? So that also creates challenges for raising money, because now, you can only sell 49% of your company, and the investors are going to say, well, you didn't put any money in. I don't want to just have, 49% of the company. I should be the majority shareholder, right? So now you've got competing interests where it's on one hand, it's yeah, sure, you want the social equity person to benefit from the license. You don't want the investor to get all the profits. But what if the investor says, hey, if I don't get enough of the profits, I'm just not going to invest the money? Now, the state has said they're going to finance these businesses, provide low interest rate loans. They're going to help them with real estate. But, are they going to be on time with that money?
Well, didn't they have issues already with the bank account, getting their whole, the whole fund even financed and finding banking themselves? I quickly glanced at that a while ago. And I think just how regulation works in general and all this stuff, it would be a little bit, Okay. Wow. So that's interesting. That made me just think about, there's a lot of entrepreneurs that listen to this podcast that, have already started operations, that maybe are in existing markets and are at this point that are looking to raise capital. I think a big question for a lot of people that often comes up when I talk to people is, well, I've worked so hard to do this, or I've done this. I should be able to get X percentage of this company. And obviously there's valuation to play of meaning like, what's the value of the company? There's different ways to look at the valuation of that company. But how do you go about that approach with somebody who maybe is a newbie in terms of, never having raised capital before, but having a conversation about that? And maybe we could even give the example of like, okay, yes, you do have a license, but there's really no value attached to that license if you haven't built a brand, but you could also say, well, I can argue against myself, playing devil's advocate. Well, maybe there really is the team behind it and all that. So what do you think about that?
Well, I think it depends on what license you have, right? So if you win one of these card licenses and you are one of X number, they did come out, I don't know, remember the numbers off my tab I had, but they did release a list of where they're, how many licenses they were going to issue by geographic area in New York State. So, if you get a prime Brooklyn or prime Manhattan location, that license, I think, has value and interest to investors. As I say that, I've also heard the other argument from people who say, I want to be upstate, where there's much less of an illicit market, where there are no delivery services, where the local sheriff would have you is going to shut down an illegal business, and I'll be the only business in town in, like a Binghamton, right? Or something like that, right? Where it's like, maybe that's actually a lot more bad. But in any event, you got to look at what kind of license you have, right? Because not all licenses have value, but some licenses do have value. And obviously, as from being in this industry for a while, I mean, there's been, it may not be the case today, but historically, a lot of people have flipped licenses for a tidy profit. A lot of people have made money that way. But I guess I would say, first thing, anyone raising money in cannabis right now, it's, just, it ain't for the faint of heart. So definitely, prepare yourself mentally, physically, spiritually, emotionally for what is frankly a full-time job. I find that a lot of companies, sometimes the founder just raises money and, another founder runs the company, right? Because I think it could be tough to do both. But it's tough. And I mean, you got to have a compelling story. And I mean, the only thing I can really help with is there's a lot of regulatory hair sometimes on these deals. And I think you just need to make sure you understand the answer up front so you don't surprise any investors down the road. Because that's something I discovered early on is that, with regulatory approval for deals in 99.9% of cases, the deal, if it gets rejected or impacted by regulatory approval, it's because someone along the line doesn't want to provide something to the regulators. It's almost never that, hey, one of my investors, has an extensive criminal history. That almost never comes up. It's always, hey, this high net worth individual who's backing my company won't give me fingerprints. And the state is telling me until they get those fingerprints, they won't issue me a final license. So you can get caught kind of between two kind of forces you don't really control.
No, and you have to learn negotiation and mediation or work with a lawyer to really kind of move that. And then as you've been doing M&A, what are you seeing? I am curious, are you seeing more mergers or more acquisitions happening from, I guess with the caveat of like over the past few years and like what has changed?
Well, I mean, if you saw the news today about this Cresco Columbia Care divestiture. So, I mean, I guess this is one of the news stories in M&A is because of the license caps, whenever you do sort of a mega cannabis deal, there almost always needs to be spin-offs because, the combined company will exceed the cap in, one or more states. So that's kind of an interesting story.
Will you explain that a little bit more? Because I'm like, that went over my head. So okay.
I'll use New York. I use Massachusetts as an example, even though I don't think this deal involved Massachusetts. Suppose, you own company A, I own company B. We each own 3 of each type of license in Massachusetts, which is to say that we're at the license cap.
Okay.
To simplify, we both have 3 adult use stores in Massachusetts. The cap is 3. Okay. So, for one reason or another, we want to do, a merger of equals, because of our national footprint. The problem is in Massachusetts, the regulators are never going to approve that deal because the one company can't have 6 licenses. Mm-hmm. So now you got to sell 3 licenses as part of the deal, which I guess, in the non-cannabis world, this is more of like a typical, like a Hart-Scott-Rodino antitrust issue where you need to spin off assets at deal close. But in cannabis, it's become state by state. So like maybe you have to sell 3 licenses in Massachusetts and then you have to sell 2 licenses in Ohio, right? So that I think is one of the new kind of trends in cannabis M&A. And of course it creates opportunities for a third party. In this case, Combs, which is what, Puff Daddy is going by now. According to the article, I lost track of what he goes
New identities all the time.
He'll always be P. Diddy to me.
Me too.
So he's starting his own company, right? And he's picking up these licenses as part of the deal. So that I just think, I'm just throwing that out there. I think that's like an interesting trend. Is like whenever there's spinoffs, hopefully someone can come in and find value in the spun off licenses. But to answer your question, I think people will tell you sort of like the Columbia Care Cresco style deal, like the mega merger is, you don't see as much of that right now, largely because, the industry's capital constrained. I think what you're going to see, honestly, in the next 12 months is a lot of distressed deals as people just run out of cash, which, can take a bunch of different forms. Sometimes it's the early investors coming in, putting more capital in, maybe diluting everyone else down and essentially wiping out their value just because they're demanding it to save the company. Sometimes you can see, some debt here, though I think a lot of the debt funds are going to be pretty wary of lending into a company that's in trouble. Especially talking to them. I mean, they're telling, if you talk to them, they'll tell you, hey, we can't lend to a company unless we believe they've got a viable long-term business plan. Right. Yeah. So if you're in distress now, because it's a short-term issue, that's one thing. But if you're in distress because, hey, your business model in California no longer makes sense, that's a tougher issue, right?
It's so devastating. Yeah. Because from your, from what you've seen, who you've talked to, and I guess just knowing the market, do you believe that most of the distressed assets or companies that are in financial distress are a result of just managing the business incorrectly or because of regulation and tax?
I mean, obviously there's going to be, there's like some, I don't know what percentage it's the management issue. I think that's definitely an issue. I mean, I think the big issue that I think we've seen is that, and this may not be a management issue, it's just hard to predict the future, right? Is that people did not necessarily anticipate the current fundraising environment, right? And if you were spending money, you raise your A, you get a bunch of money in the bank, and you're like, all right, let's sprint, let's grow, build a national brand, and then we'll raise our B in, 12 to 16 months, let's say. And then it comes time to raise your B and the capital, there's no private capital, right?
Yeah.
So that's where you kind of find now you've got, 4 months of cash left. So what do you do?
Exactly. That's like the big question and a very hard answer. Different answers, but yeah, what do you do? I mean, you'd hope you could find some capital, but that's, I think, the hard issue, which then brings me to like, what's happening with the Climate Act? Like, is that is there hope on a federal level
I was going to say I think safe banking.
Okay.
Would be the best, but the Climate Act, I looked at it. I read a summary of it. I just don't think it's going to pass.
Okay.
And I have like maybe I'm also not, I'm not a lobbyist and I'm not a CEO of a cannabis company trying to inspire investors, and I'm a lawyer. So I guess by both nature and training, I tend to be a little negative.
Yeah.
So I guess to me, the problem is just the Senate. I mean, I guess you say, people talk about like, could you pass something through a lame duck Senate? You know, maybe. I guess the problem is Mitch McConnell. And then if the Republicans take the Senate, people have been saying, oh, the Republicans are going to take this issue for years. I really haven't seen them do it. So the SAFE Act won't allow you to list on an exchange. It'll make banking easier, getting a depository account easier, and hopefully cheaper, because people have to basically pay a fee for a depository account. And there's a lot more depository accounts available now than there used to be. So, I mean, it would be good. It would be great. I think it would help the momentum. Yeah. And help everyone's like,
spirit. I would say spirit, right? Because I think it's like people have started, they want to see it through because it's been so stagnated. Like, we just don't see what the real market is because it's federally illegal. I just think that's the hardest thing. So that would be depository accounts. But in terms of like ever accessing like an SBA loan or any of that stuff, what has to happen? Does it just have to get descheduled? Or could this, okay.
Or I suppose you could pass a bill that would do it, but it would have to get, either descheduled or rescheduled, to the bottom of the list of the schedules, for federal stuff to happen. I mean, my 2 cents is to the states, which I think the regulators that should actually care here, is don't wait for the feds. I think we're in this ourselves. I don't think anyone's coming to save us. I think the states need to move to protect their industries and protect these jobs. I think, California needs to take a hard look at what it's doing. If you want my opinion, what I tell regulators is I think regulators need to spend at least 51% of their time regulating the illicit market instead of over-regulating people that are trying to follow the law. Because we have clients, you get fines, you get rejection. It's like you're hyper-regulated. Meanwhile, the illicit market is allowed to do whatever they want with impunity. Yeah. And it seems to me like the regulators should spend an equivalent amount of time enforcing the law against people that are egregiously violating the law than focusing all their time on people that, they may be violating the law, but it's, it's like, it's a foot fault versus, blatant cheating.
Absolutely. And then I was like, well, I wonder why, because I remember even being in LA at the very beginning, like 2018, and like them and Los Angeles trying to crack down on the illicit market and doing, raids and all of that stuff. And they do make some impact. I'm curious if the argument for regulators is just like, well, it's so costly, or they're not, there's no revenue but maybe there is actually from an illicit market seizure, but then you do actually have assets. I don't know what actually happens with that. I'm just curious, like what, because that's a very valid point. That to me is a big solution to allowing, the true regulated market to thrive.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there's a resources and time issue, right? I mean, especially with like the size and scope of the illicit market. But, for example, here's what I would do in New York, and which I tell people, given any have the opportunity, is there are dispensaries operating illegally in storefronts in Manhattan. They have landlords. Send a letter to the landlord saying you have 45 days to kick this person out, or else we're going to bring criminal charges against you for aiding and abetting.
Yeah.
And I think these landlords in Manhattan, I mean, these are like seriously deep-pocketed people. If you own real estate in Manhattan, they're going to kick them out. I mean, they're going to be terrified, right? So it's different. Like a delivery service is different. That's a little bit harder, but I mean, I don't think you should be allowing people to operate storefront dispensaries in Manhattan. To me, that's absurd. Why would you even create why would you create a license system if you're going to allow people to operate without a license? Yeah. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah. Did you see the same stuff happen? Like you're in Boston right now. Like was this like in the Massachusetts market? No. Okay.
No. Massachusetts never. I mean, listen. There's an illicit market in Massachusetts, but it was there was nothing ever as sort of like open and flagrant as New York, right? Where you just see people have like food trucks in New York. then there's like physical dispensary locations, and then like every bodega is selling like Delta 8, Delta 9, which is illegal under state law. So Massachusetts was never like this. The illicit market was never as sort of, as strong in Massachusetts as it is in like New York or California.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe it's just those two states in general. And from what you're working on, are you working nationally? You as yourself, your firm is working nationally, but and maybe even internationally. Do you work in Canada? Vicente Sederberg,
I work with a lot of Canadians, but more like inbound into the U.S.
Okay.
Obviously, I don't know any Canadian law. I definitely do international stuff where either advising U.S. companies on the legality of doing business overseas, which is it usually is legal, or with international people that want to expand into the U.S. Start a company here or ship their products here. So we do a fair amount of that. And then, I do stuff all over the country. I'm usually in any given day across all time zones in the U.S., but primarily Colorado, New York, Massachusetts are the three states where I'm barred.
Yeah. And it seems like I saw one of your articles about like psychedelics and what's happening in Colorado. How are you spending your time? Because it seems like now there's this another, industry that is part of, I guess, this plant-based medicine industry. That seems very exciting and a lot of kind of movement. Like, how do you spend your time between everything?
Yeah, no, it's super exciting. I mean, 122 in Colorado, which is going to create, I guess, a something similar to cannabis, but for psychedelic medicines in Colorado is super exciting. Candidly, I spend zero time on psychedelics right now.
Okay.
Really. Just because it's at this point, there's really nothing to do.
That's what I was wondering, like, is there even, it just seems like regulation, something needs to pass to allow more than just research to happen.
Yeah.
Right?
So you've got like basically two kind of parallel industries in my mind, right? One of which is like, it doesn't exist yet. It's passed in Oregon. It will hopefully, I mean, we're polling well, but if everyone votes the right way, hopefully, knock wood, it'll pass in Colorado. And so that's kind of it's legal at the state level, but it's outside of the traditional medical system. Then there are all these companies that are operating within the traditional medical system that have drugs somewhere along the phased approval timeline with the FDA. So, Compass is a big name in that world, right? So those tend to be publicly listed. Compass is private, but a lot of them are publicly listed, and they're basically pharma companies. But I don't really do that type of work. So yeah, there's not and then in psychedelics, there's stuff at the margins, right? There's a bunch of tech companies out there that are doing stuff like they're gathering data from trips, and they repackage it and use it and provide it to people to help guide therapy. So there's that kind of stuff, but it is limited right now because no one's got a license right now in the U.S.
Okay. So it's just, again, some buzz, stuff is moving, but not at the pace where maybe the media makes it seem.
Yeah, well, it's moving. I mean, there is stuff out there. I mean, there's ketamine clinics. Yeah, so ketamine clinics is something that's going on right now. That's really the only FDA approved psychedelic. It's Schedule 3. And it's not approved as a psychedelic, but you can write it off script. So you could go to a ketamine clinic today if you wanted to. That would be the only kind of legal psychedelics you could take. Otherwise, you'd have to get enrolled in a study. So there are clinics that are doing psychedelic work that are, perfectly federally legal, but they're associated with studies. So like the big one in Colorado is the MAP study. And then other than those two options, right, if you're doing psychedelics today, you're probably going to sort of like a, kind of I call it non-commercial because it's not licensed. It's underground. It's like, so that stuff is like, that kind of world they don't really need corporate lawyers.
No, not yet. Not yet.
Not yet. No, you don't document that stuff now.
No. What is it that you're really excited about that you've been working on and that you're just like as you kind of like think about like we're ending the year and, I always like to think about like, where do we want to be in 12 months? Like, what is that for you?
For me, I mean, the New York market is something that really excites me. I mean, it worries me too. It's to me, it's like such a huge opportunity, but at the same time, I worry a lot about how it's going to break. If it's going to be doable for a lot of these licensees. But, one thing I really like about the New York market is the vertical integration prohibition. So, what they really are trying to do is prevent one big company or, a handful of big companies like some states from dominating the market, which I think is good, for competition and good for, opportunity. So I would say New York is a huge thing that I'm excited for. I'm pretty excited about the psychedelic thing in Colorado. I don't know if there are any other states in particular that excite. I mean, there's a lot of states I think are going to be interesting, like Maryland and Missouri with adult use, but I'm not going to have time to focus on those. And then I guess, I've been pretty interested in debt financing recently, just because that's been the money that's been coming into cannabis that we've seen. So a lot of our clients have been taking on debt just because it's more available than equity right now. Though interest rates are going up. So the terms on that's pretty rough.
I was going to say, like, what are the average terms? And because of inflation, like, and just interest rates in general, like, are they?
It's tough. It's tough. Well, first off, like most cannabis companies are not good candidates for debt. The lenders want people with a long-term business plan that they feel comfortable with, right? And they want, revenue, EBITDA, historical. So, it's like, and they really want collateral, which is usually real estate. So, if you don't have that, it's a really risky loan for them to make. And then in terms of the terms, we're seeing sort of like high teens. Because it's gone up. I mean, it was high before we saw interest rates rising, and now with interest rates rising, going even up. It's interesting. Most of the terms in the debt deals you saw in cannabis pre, Fed action were fixed rate loans, which I think is a little atypical. At least back when I was doing bank, I did some bank debt deals in my like early days as a junior associate, which is a long time ago. But back then you saw, floating rate loans, tied to LIBOR. Okay. And bonds tended to be more fixed rate, but now we're starting to see floating rates for these loans just because of the interest rate environment. And then the other thing I always tell people, if you're thinking about signing a debt term sheet, like make sure you understand it and you make sure a lawyer has looked at it, because these debt term sheets are not completely non-binding. The lenders will typically expect you to pay for their diligence costs and their legal fees.
Is that like included in like amortized throughout the loan though, or is that like an
they'll typically just fund it net.
Okay.
But if you don't get the money, they still expect to get paid.
Yeah.
Because the lender will say, well, I can't take the risk, right? Like I can't spend $200,000 to look at your company and then find out there's a major issue.
Yeah. Yeah. And just like if somebody's listening and they're like, well, I've been operating for a while and I do think I have a business plan and I do have, positive net income. Maybe they're not looking at their financials and looking at EBITDA. What type of, like, what is, I guess, like, if we want to say benchmark what some of these lenders are even looking for as like a minimum amount of revenue or a minimum amount of EBITDA, do they have those requirements of like, I won't even look at somebody at this level?
A lot of them will. I mean, sort of the bigger names in the industry you see, right? I mean, they need to make loans. I'm just looking at my notes here.
Yeah.
They need to make loans of a certain size, right? Because it doesn't make sense for them to make a $500K loan, right? It's just too much work. So, I mean, part of it is like, can your company do a $10 million deal, right?
Yeah.
At least a $5 million deal. Cause I don't think you're going to see people, looking for, that much. And then of course, like when you're talking about that kind of money, I don't know if there's like a set EBITDA or revenue requirement. But you got to think about like, if it's a $10 million loan.
Exactly.
You need to have a certain fixed interest, you need to meet the coverage ratio, right?
Yeah.
So I would look into coverage ratios and think about, do you have the cash flow that they're going to feel comfortable, that you're not in any kind of trouble, or, that they're not in risk. And then I think, collateral is always a good thing.
Yeah, I was going to say, especially if you're doing these type of deals, and then even with mergers or acquisitions, obviously real estate, there's value there. A license, you could say that there's value there. What about brand value? Have you been seeing that a lot at play, where there is enough behind, the analysis that somebody is doing? Not yet. No.
I don't think lenders, as far as I know, the lenders I talk to, I don't think are particularly comfortable around brand value, because from a lender's perspective, it's, if this thing goes south,
what am I going to get?
What am I going to get? Right. And who's going to buy the brand? Yeah. So how much does a distressed brand go for right now? I mean, in California, it's not going to be a ton. So I don't think the brand, unfortunately, right, is going to be super enticing to lenders. I think cash flow is something they like. And then, sometimes these loans are, the term of them is pretty short, right? So you need 2 to 5 years, which is different than what you would see if General, I don't know what we could look it up, but General Electric, I'm sure they've got a bank deadline, right? I bet it's not a 2-year term, right? Because the problem is for these people. Yeah, exactly. If you think about it, if you're signing a 15-year term, who in the world could tell you 2037, what does cannabis look like in America? I mean, that's a tough question, right? I mean, I would say it's an unanswerable question.
That's a good, that's very interesting. When I started this podcast, I always would say, I thought, when I got in this space in 2015, I was I think cannabis would be legalized at a federal level by 2023. I missed the mark. And so that is an interesting question, is as we do wrap up this interview, when you think about, let's not say 2037, that's too wild for me, but 2030, because that's a very monumental year and kind of touch point, I think, in a lot of things that will be happening in the world. What do you think cannabis would look like by 2030? Okay,
I'll answer it first, but I'm curious to hear your answer as well. In 2030, so I think we'll be federally legal by 2030. Okay. I think it'll be legal in almost every state by 2030. I feel the Idaho might still hold out.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, of course, because Mississippi has a medical program right now, right? Which is you think about what states would be the deepest red state. Federal legal, I think almost all the brands that are out there right now are probably not household names. I think they're brands you haven't even heard of that are household names at this point. I mean, it's just I hope our clients are still around, I hope I'm still around, but I think there's going to be a lot of turnover. A lot of people that are not in the game anymore, in 2030. And what I think you're going to see, I guess one prediction I feel confident about is I don't think there's going to be strong international trade in cannabis. I think countries are going to put up protectionist barriers to prevent other countries from growing cheaply and importing into the U.S. You're not going to be able to get these state protection regimes in place because they're just unconstitutional, and I think they'll fall apart at the first pressure test under the Dormant Commerce Clause. Okay. But I don't think the U.S. is going to have any appetite to allow all of the weed to be grown in Colombia, which you could do so cheaply, right? I mean, you can grow year round down there. Do you think though that there would be a law that would allow some form of importation for Colombia, or that there would be? Yeah, I think by 2030 you'll get something like the MORE Act or the States Act, where it's essentially if it's legal in the state, it's legal. Yeah. Okay. I like your analysis. It's interesting because I'm in Portugal, and there's a few medical grows, but all they do is export. And it's in this country, it's been decriminalized for quite some time, but the flavor of, and just the perception of consuming cannabis, it's not really there. And you can find CBD in pharmacies, and
people kind of talk about it, but it's not at that point. And I haven't really done,
where are they exporting to?
That's what I haven't really done that much investigation. I don't know where they're exporting it to. It would make sense that it would be Germany. I'll actually follow up, and maybe before I
don't know what the German demand is, right? That's interesting. Yeah.
Because German, it's interesting because in Europe in general, like, cause I was in France before I moved to Portugal, and it's like, they were just they started doing medical trials, but the way that it was already working, it was like going to just a few different pharmaceutical companies. The prime minister was like, it was the health minister was like, we are never going to have an adult use. Like, that's what he said like a year or two ago. So I'm curious from an international standpoint, what will happen, but I don't know. I actually by the time I release this, I'll maybe add a little bit to the podcast and I will let you know, and I'll do some investigating.
Well, there's this crazy thing, right, about with Germany, with how they're dealing with the EU Commission, right? Because they would technically have to violate those rules. It's like there's too much going on. I can't follow. The European market's super interesting to me. I wish I had more time to focus on it, but.
Well, I'll give you some updates because I honestly haven't, I haven't. From my perspective, it's interesting, but it's a little bit too slow, and I couldn't figure out what was so interesting because I may be doing a podcast or two about it. So I think maybe that'll be what's next. 2030, I don't know. So we've got essentially 2 election cycles, right? The way that cannabis states are legalizing and people's perception of cannabis is like increasing exponentially. Like 93% of Americans now are in favor of some form. I think that it will be federally legal for sure. I think that there's going to be more focus on hemp. We didn't really talk about hemp at all in this conversation.
Yeah.
But hemp from an environmental perspective, because 2030 is a very, like, when you think about global warming, when you think about food short, like, it's a big year. And I think that in that stance, I think that hemp's going to be very big. Also, it seems like from a medical perspective, people will, I think that we'll see cannabis a lot more. Especially if it's federally legal, it would be amazing to see it being integrated into the healthcare system. But then that begs the question of, what schedule is it? Because because if they decide to schedule it at a 2 or a 3, like, what's going to happen with an adult use dispensary? Like, how would that even work?
Yeah. It could be, it wouldn't work with the current system, right? Or I guess the system continues and it just remains to be illegal. And there's still, I guess if it's 3, it's no longer subject to 280E, which helps.
Exactly. Yes. Huge.
But it would still be illegal and you just run an illegal business. And I guess it's tough to get financing. I don't know. It's a strange set of circumstances.
It really is. So it's just like, I guess it just opens Pandora's box because you have to decide, or you'd have to hope like, hopefully it just gets descheduled. But then it is so interesting because of all of the medical benefits. And then you could really showcase and really do a lot more research. And then you do have the medical path that would hopefully be integrated into more mainstream medicine, which then you question, like, what would happen with pharmaceuticals? And then you also still have like the adult use path with what we've been talking about and how important and interesting all that stuff is. So I haven't thought about it actually for a while. I will simmer on it for a bit. But as we wrap up, speed round, just very, very fast, just a few questions. And are you ready?
Shoot.
Why did you get in the cannabis industry?
I wanted to get in the ground floor, something new where I could get in at the start.
Mm-hmm. Why do you do what you do?
I guess because it's what I've been trained to do. Mm-hmm. So, I don't know what else. I think I'm a much better lawyer than I would be a grower. Yeah. So I think it fits my skill set.
Awesome. What is one piece of advice you'd give somebody that just wants to get started into this space?
I always tell people that want to be cannabis lawyers to learn a non-cannabis area of law. because that bread and butter stuff, it's every company has the same, cannabis companies have employment issues, they have real estate issues, you know what I mean? So I say learn a bread and butter area of law in addition to knowing the cannabis regulations and the cannabis industry.
Yes. Yeah. And even if you're not thinking about doing cannabis law, like that's very important too. Like, I think that's what's so hard about this space. It's like, oh, there's so much. Well, stick to a specific thing, hone in on that and let that kind of be your thing. Because I think when I first got in, I was like, oh, there's just so much to do, but just like focus on what you're good at. All right, Charlie, anything else before, well, how can people find you? And anything else?
Well, yeah. So I was going to say, I guess first off, I have to hawk my book.
Oh my God, actually, no, I wanted to talk to you. I forgot. I didn't put that in my notes and I wanted to talk to you about your book. I wanted to because
this is my book.
Yes.
The Cannabis Business, Understanding Law, Finance, and Governance in America's Newest Industry. I wrote it with Cassia Furman, who's my partner. She's based in LA. And it's just sort of like, I guess I'll call it Cannabis Law 101. So if you want to learn like the basics of cannabis law, it's out of date, but I mean, the fundamentals are still the case. Yes. So all profits go to Last Prisoner Project. So I got to mention the book.
We'll put it in the show notes.
Thank you. Otherwise, I'm Charlie at VicenteSederberg.com, which is a little tough to spell, but if you just Google my last name, I'll pop up. It's a pretty unique last name. So just email me, you can just email me at work. I'm also on, like LinkedIn, I guess, but, where I just post, articles that me or my colleagues write or, interesting stuff about cannabis. So, feel free to reach out. You can call me too. I mean, my number's on the website, on the firm website. That's probably the easiest way to find me.
Cool. And I'll put all this stuff in the show notes. I do have a question about the book. So what was did you both talk about it for a while? Like, hey, we're not seeing this. We want to do this, because writing a book is, even if you're a lawyer and you like to write, it's still a lot of work.
Honestly, I'll say my dad always told me,
mm-hmm.
That he thinks he should have written more.
Yeah.
And that it's a good way to establish credibility. So my dad, my dad sort of put that seed in my head. I will say this though, what I've learned about the publishing industry, is that in today's world, right, you gotta have reach, right? If you want to sell a book, right? It's not who's a good writer, it's who's got like an email list or YouTube following, or, Instagram, TikTok, what have you, right? Like, it's just really tough to sell books in today's environment. That's what I've learned about I was going to say, as tough as the cannabis industry is,
yeah,
I'm glad I'm not in the publishing industry. That's a tough industry these days.
It's so interesting because I have one book on Amazon when I got into the space about 280E, like very easy, like 101 basics, like not as big. It's an ebook. And then one of the things that I've just been wanting to do it and I've started it, but I completely agree with you on Reach. It's about personal finance, but much more geared towards, it's more geared towards like holistic living and with the more of a focus for women, but I hope that everybody could read it. Kind of like a Rich Dad, Poor Dad, but more of like, not so much shame, right? But like tactics on some of the, of personal finance, but highly competitive. And what you said is very true, because if you do use a distribution channel like Amazon, being able to like show up after like whatever 40,000 other books related to personal finance, like how is somebody going to find you? And so I completely agree. I have a friend that she actually quit her job several years ago and just makes a living off of publishing books. And she's very successful. She does fiction books. And so I asked her, I was like,
that's a tough gig. I was going to say like the percentage of fiction writers that I think earn a living off it is such a tiny fraction.
She's one of them.
I feel like it really is like an industry where it's like, I don't know. It's not like 80-20. It's probably like 1% does 99% of the sales or something like that.
Yeah. I even got a plugin to start looking under kind of like keywords on Amazon just to kind of build that strategy. But I completely agree with you. It's like you want to have that following or you need to have that distribution channel to get there. Cause I don't think even if you wanted to do paid media, I think you could, but anyway,
I was going to say, the last thing I'll say here is I'll share my cannabis story, which is that I have been rejected for advertising for both Amazon and Facebook.
What?
Because of cannabis.
But
and
Amazon.
Yeah, exactly. Well, they'll let me sell the book, but they said it's it's got drugs. There's a weed leaf on the cover. So they just were, by the way, these big tech companies, right? I get why everyone's so mad at them, because when they shut you down, it's not like there's an appeal they just kind of tell you no, right? Yeah. And then and if you ask them a question, they're well, read our terms of, it's your 100-page terms of service doesn't tell me the answer. So anyway, I get that, that's cannabis challenge is this marketing aspect in a world that, you get rejected.
Well, can I give you, if you want to get it on more of the, in the more mainstream, what I started doing to just get more awareness to accountants about the cannabis industry is I started talking about the cannabis industry on accounting podcasts, and they love that stuff. And so it's interesting because they have huge reach and not a lot of people talk about it. So maybe that's the way. And you've also got a very good, you're donating it to the Lost Prisoners Project. all the funds are going there. So yeah, very interesting.
The vast fortune I'm making from my book.
Yeah, but didn't it feel good getting it published and being yes, it is, it's launched, it's done. It's a creative art.
Yeah. It's in the Library of Congress. So,
amen to that.
My legacy.
Amen to that. Well, Charlie, thank you so much. Yeah. I hope that we can get you on again. This was a great conversation.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for listening to this week's show. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you enjoyed this, leave us a 5-star review. Make sure that you share this episode on your social media and tag us in the Instagram stories. You can find us wherever you go on social media. Just look up Cannabis Business Minds. Have an idea for the show or something that you want to talk about? Shoot us an email at podcast@cannabisbusinessminds.com.